Breaking. All new Trump tariffs have just got into effect. Here is the full list. China 104%. Lesotho 50%. Cambodia 49%. Laos 48%. Madagascar 47%. Vietnam 46%. Myanmar 44%. Sri Lanka 44%. Falkland Islands 41%. Syria 41%. Mauritius 40%. Iraq 39%. Guyana 38%. Bangladesh 37%. Botswana 37%. Liechtenstein 37%. Serbia 37%. Thailand 36%. Bosnia and Herzegovina 35%. North Macedonia 33%. Angola 32%. Fiji 32%. Indonesia 32%. Taiwan 32%. Libya 31%. Moldova 31%. Switzerland 31%. Algeria 30%. Nauru 30%. South Africa 30%. Pakistan 29%. Tunisia 28%. Kazakhstan 27%. India 26%. South Korea 25%. Brunei 24%. Japan 24%. Malaysia 24%. Vanuatu 22%. Cote d'Ivoire 21%. Namibia 21%. European Union 20%. Jordan 20%. Nicaragua 18%. Zimbabwe 18%. Israel 17%. Malawi 17%. Philippines 17%. Zambia 17%. Mozambique 16%. Norway 15%. Venezuela 15%. Nigeria 14%. Chad 13%. Equatorial Guinea 13%. Cameroon 11%. Democratic Republic of the Congo 11%. Afghanistan 10%. Albania 10%. Andorra 10%. Anguilla 10%. Antigua and Barbuda 10%. Argentina 10%. Armenia 10%. Aruba 10%. Australia 10%. Azerbaijan 10%. Bahamas 10%. Bahrain 10%. Barbados 10%. Belize 10%. Benin 10%. Bermuda 10%. Bhutan 10%. Bolivia 10%. Brazil 10%. British Indian Ocean Territory 10%. British Virgin Islands 10%. Burundi 10%. Cabo Verde 10%. Cayman Islands 10%. Central African Republic 10%. Chile 10%. Christmas Island 10%. Cocos, Keeling Islands 10%. Colombia 10%. Comoros 10%. Cook Islands 10%. Costa Rica 10%. Curacao 10%. Djibouti 10%. Dominica 10%. Dominican Republic 10%. Ecuador 10%. Egypt 10%. El Salvador 10%. Eritrea 10%. Eswatini 10%. Ethiopia 10%. French Guiana 10%. French Polynesia 10%. Gabon 10%. Gambia 10%. Georgia 10%. Ghana 10%. Gibraltar 10%. Grenada 10%. Guadeloupe 10%. Guatemala 10%. Guinea 10%. Guinea-Bissau 10%. Haiti 10%. Heard and McDonald Islands 10%. Honduras 10%. Iceland 10%. Iran 10%. Jamaica 10%. Kenya 10%. Kiribati 10%. Kosovo 10%. Kuwait 10%. Kyrgyzstan 10%. Lebanon 10%. Liberia 10%. Maldives 10%. Mali 10%. Marshall Islands 10%. Martinique 10%. Mauritania 10%. Mayotte 10%. Micronesia 10%. Monaco 10%. Mongolia 10%. Montenegro 10%. Montserrat 10%. Morocco 10%. Nepal 10%. New Zealand 10%. Niger 10%. Norfolk Island 10%. Oman 10%. Panama 10%. Papua New Guinea 10%. Paraguay 10%. Peru 10%. Qatar 10%. Republic of the Congo 10%. Reunion 10%. Rwanda 10%. St. Helena 10%. St. Kitts and Nevis 10%. St. Lucia 10%. San Pierre and Miquelon 10%. St. Vincent and the Grenadines 10%. Samoa 10%. San Marino 10%. Sao Tome and Principe 10%. Saudi Arabia 10%. Senegal 10%. Sierra Leone 10%. Singapore 10%. Sint Maarten 10%. Solomon Islands 10%, South Sudan 10%, Sudan 10%, Suriname 10%, Svalbard and Jan Mayen 10%, Tajikistan 10%, Tanzania 10%, Timor-Leste 10%, Togo 10%, Tokelau 10%, Tonga 10%, Trinidad and Tobago 10%, Turkey 10%, Turkmenistan 10%, Turks and Caicos Islands 10%, Tuvalu 10%, Uganda 10%, Ukraine 10%, United Arab Emirates 10%, United Kingdom 10%, Uruguay 10%, Uzbekistan 10%, Yemen 10%. For more updates join our Telegram channel, Cryptogranth. Thank you.